David sat at the head of the long dining table, watching his daughter Emily across the room as she chatted with her fiancé Ryan. The private dining area of the upscale restaurant buzzed with quiet conversation, silverware clinking against fine china. The rehearsal dinner was meant to be a joyful occasion, a prelude to what was supposed to be the happiest day of Emily's life. Yet, despite the warmth of the candlelight and the celebratory air, David could feel an undercurrent of tension, a silent wall that had been there for years but had become more obvious in recent weeks. He turned to Sarah, his fiancée, who sat beside him with her hands clasped in her lap. She was doing her best to appear at ease, smiling politely at the guests, but he knew her well enough to see through the facade. He reached for her hand under the table, giving it a reassuring squeeze. She returned the gesture, but there was a flicker of sadness in her eyes. Sarah had been in David's life for 5 years now. After losing his wife, Emily's mother, to a sudden illness nearly a decade ago, he had never thought he would find love again. For years, it had just been him and Emily against the world. He had devoted himself entirely to raising her, putting her needs before his own, and making sure she never felt the absence of her mother any more than she already did. When Sarah came along, David had been cautious, unsure if he was ready to open his heart again. But Sarah had been patient, kind, and understanding. She never tried to replace Emily's mother. She simply wanted to be part of their lives in whatever way they would allow. Emily, however, had never fully accepted Sarah. At first, David had chalked it up to teenage stubbornness. Emily had been 16 when he started dating Sarah, and he had assumed it was normal resistance to change. But as the years went on, her coldness never thawed. She was never outright rude, at least not in a way that could be called out, but there was an unmistakable distance, an invisible barrier that Sarah could never quite break through. Now, at 24, Emily had matured in many ways. She had graduated from college, started a promising career, and found love with Ryan. David had hoped that her engagement and impending marriage would mark a turning point, that she would finally come to terms with the fact that Sarah was a permanent part of their lives. But tonight, as he watched her avoid eye contact with Sarah and keep her conversations carefully directed at anyone else in the room, he realized just how deep the divide still was. The evening went on, filled with the usual small talk and reminiscing. Friends and family shared stories about Emily and Ryan, recalling childhood antics and early relationship milestones. Every now and then, Sarah would try to join the conversation, offering a fond memory from the past few years or simply agreeing with someone's sentiment, but each time Emily's response was clipped, her smile tight, as if she was barely tolerating Sarah's presence. At one point, Ryan, ever the peacekeeper, tried to bridge the gap. "You know," he said, nudging Emily playfully, "Sarah actually helped me pick out the ring." David saw Sarah's eyes widen slightly. She hadn't expected Ryan to bring that up, and neither had David. Emily turned to Ryan, her expression unreadable. "She did?" Ryan nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, I was completely overwhelmed with all the choices, and I wanted to get it just right. I knew your dad would be no help. Sorry, David," he added with a grin, "but Sarah has great taste and she knows you well. She gave me some solid advice." Sarah let out a soft, nervous laugh. "I just pointed him in the right direction. He did all the hard work." For a moment, there was silence. Then Emily reached for her wine glass, taking a slow sip before replying. "Well," she said finally, setting the glass down with careful precision, "I guess that explains why it's not something I would have picked for myself." The air around the table shifted uncomfortably. A few guests chuckled awkwardly, unsure of whether Emily was joking. David felt his jaw tighten, but before he could say anything, Sarah spoke up. "I understand," she said, her voice light but measured. "Choosing a ring is such a personal thing. Ryan did a beautiful job, though. It suits you." Emily didn't respond. Instead, she turned to Ryan and began discussing something about the wedding seating chart as if the conversation had never happened. David exhaled slowly, willing himself to stay calm. He knew calling Emily out in front of everyone wouldn't accomplish anything, but his patience was wearing thin. Sarah had done nothing to deserve this constant dismissal. A little while later, when the main course had been cleared and dessert was being served, David stood up and tapped his glass with a fork. The room quieted, all eyes turning to him. He smiled, despite the lingering tension, and raised his glass. "I just want to take a moment to say how incredibly happy I am to be here tonight, celebrating my beautiful daughter and her wonderful fiancé," he began. "Emily, from the moment you were born, you have been the greatest joy of my life. Watching you grow into the amazing woman you are today has been an honor. And Ryan, you are exactly the kind of man I hoped Emily would find, kind, patient, and completely devoted to her." He turned slightly, glancing at Sarah before continuing. "And I also want to take a moment to acknowledge someone very special. Sarah, you have been my rock through so many ups and downs. Your kindness, your strength, and your love have meant the world to me. I know that blending families isn't always easy, but I am so grateful for the love and support you have given both me and Emily over the years. I wouldn't be the man I am today without you." Sarah smiled softly, her eyes shining with emotion. The guests clapped politely, and David felt a small sense of relief. Maybe this would be the moment where things started to change. But then Emily stood up. She wasn't smiling. With her wine glass still in hand, she looked directly at David, then at Sarah. "She's not my mother," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "And she never will be." A heavy silence fell over the room. The clinking of silverware ceased, and all eyes darted between Emily, David, and Sarah. David felt the air leave his lungs. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Sarah sat frozen, her face a mask of quiet devastation. Emily didn't wait for a response. She set her glass down with a deliberate clink, then turned and walked briskly out of the dining area. Ryan hesitated for only a second before following her, leaving the room in stunned silence. David closed his eyes for a brief moment, pressing his fingers to the bridge of his nose. He could feel the weight of every gaze on him, waiting to see what he would do. Beside him, Sarah let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her napkin. "I'm sorry," she whispered, just loud enough for him to hear. "I never wanted this to happen." David turned to her, his heart aching. "This isn't your fault," he murmured. "It never was." But deep down, he knew that tonight had changed everything. The dinner table fell silent, the sharp crack of Emily's words lingering in the air like a heavy, unspoken truth. "She's not my mother, and never will be." It was as if the room itself had been struck by a thunderclap, the echoes of her declaration rippling outwards, leaving behind a stunned stillness that no one seemed able to break. David's gaze snapped toward Sarah, his fiancée, whose face had drained of color, her eyes wide with the shock of Emily's outburst. David couldn't move. His legs felt heavy, his body numb with the weight of the situation. For a brief, fleeting moment, he wanted to call out to Emily, to stop her before she left, but something held him back. The look on her face, cold, distant, full of hurt, paralyzed him. He watched, helpless, as she turned on her heel and marched toward the door, the clinking of her heels against the floor the only sound in the room. Ryan, Emily's fiancé, seemed to hesitate for a second, looking between David and Sarah before pushing his chair back with a scrape against the floor. "I'll go after her," he muttered, already rising to his feet. His voice, though calm, carried a trace of concern. The guests shifted in their seats uncomfortably, unsure of whether to follow suit or stay seated. "Go," David said, his voice hoarse, as though he had swallowed too much air too quickly. Ryan nodded, a silent understanding between them. He made his way to the door, leaving the room in an eerie quiet, as if the tension had stretched the fabric of time itself. David turned slowly to Sarah, who sat frozen beside him. Her hands gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white, her lips trembling slightly. She blinked, as if trying to make sense of the situation, but the words she needed to say were nowhere to be found. David opened his mouth, but his words felt caught in his throat. He had never been one to shy away from confronting difficult emotions, but this was different. He had always known Emily had reservations about Sarah, but he hadn't expected this kind of public explosion. It wasn't just the words that stung, it was the raw, unfiltered pain behind them, the deep-seated grief that had never really gone away. He reached out, placing a hand on Sarah's. It was a small gesture, but it carried so much weight. An apology, an assurance, a promise that he was still there. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I never thought she'd say something like that." Sarah shook her head slowly, her gaze drifting to the empty door. "It's not your fault, David," she replied quietly, her voice strained. "I never wanted to make her feel threatened." Her words trailed off, and for a moment neither of them spoke. David's mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. Emily had always been difficult when it came to Sarah. There had been cold silences, passive-aggressive comments, moments where Sarah had tried to step forward, offering her support, only to be met with resistance. But this felt different. Emily's words had been a harsh declaration, a final line drawn in the sand, one that was impossible to ignore. David glanced around the room, at the guests who were watching with quiet uncertainty, their eyes darting from one person to the next. He didn't want to address them, didn't want to put on some forced performance for their benefit, but at the same time, he couldn't let this moment pass without acknowledging what had just happened. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he said finally, his voice hoarse but steady. I think we all need a little time. Please enjoy your dessert and we'll continue this another time." It wasn't much of an explanation, but it was the best he could manage. The guests exchanged glances, some of them nodding sympathetically. A few murmurs of agreement followed, and slowly the atmosphere began to return to normal. But it wasn't the same. The undercurrent of tension remained, swirling around the room like a storm waiting to break. As the guests resumed their quiet conversations, David stood up, pulling his chair back with a slight scrape. He looked down at Sarah, her eyes still fixed on the door through which Emily had disappeared. "I'll go after her," David said, his voice firm though a tight knot had settled in his stomach. "I need to talk to her." Sarah didn't look at him immediately, but she nodded, her voice quiet. "I understand. Just be gentle with her. She's been carrying this for a long time." David gave a small, strained smile. "I know." With that he turned and left the room, his footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway as he made his way to the front door. He wasn't sure where Emily had gone, but he knew he had to find her. This wasn't just about the wedding anymore. This was about her, about their relationship, about the unspoken things that had been brewing for years. As he stepped outside, the cool evening air hit his face, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the restaurant. He glanced around, searching for any sign of Emily. It didn't take long for him to spot her. She was sitting on a bench by the garden, her back to him, her shoulders hunched as though she were trying to make herself as small as possible. David hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to approach her. She was an adult now, no longer the little girl who had once clung to him in times of distress. But tonight, in this moment, she seemed so much younger. "Emily?" he called softly, his voice tentative, as though testing the waters. She didn't turn around. Her fingers were tightly woven together, her knuckles white. It was clear she had been crying, though she had tried to hide it. "Please, just let me be," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't deal with this right now." David's heart clenched at the rawness in her voice, but he didn't move away. He couldn't. "I'm not going anywhere, Em. I just want to talk." For a long time there was nothing but the rustling of the leaves in the trees and the distant sounds of the city. Emily didn't respond, but after what felt like an eternity, she finally spoke, her words quiet and almost broken. "You just don't get it, Dad," she said, her voice trembling. "She's not my mother, she never will be, and I don't know how to make you understand that." David took a deep breath, his chest tightening. "I do get it, Emily," he said, his voice gentle. "I really do. But this is about more than just Sarah. It's about us. About you and me." Emily didn't respond immediately. She simply sat there, staring ahead, her face shadowed by the moonlight. "I know you're still grieving your mom," David continued, stepping closer but giving her space. "I know that it's hard to accept that I've moved on, that I'm with someone else. But Sarah's never tried to replace your mom. She's never wanted to be that." Emily's shoulders tensed, and for a moment David thought she might shut down again, but then, slowly, she turned to face him, her eyes red-rimmed. "I don't care if she didn't try to replace her," Emily said, her voice low and filled with pain. "It's not about that. It's about me, about what I lost. You can't just expect me to be okay with it just because you are." David's heart ached as he watched her, the familiar ache of helplessness settling in his chest. "I'm not asking you to be okay with it, Em. I'm asking you to try. To see that Sarah isn't the enemy. She's just someone who loves me and who wants to love you too." For a moment, Emily didn't speak, her eyes flickering with emotion. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I don't know if I can." David sighed softly, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. "I know it's hard, sweetie, but I can't keep living in the past. I need you to meet me halfway, for both of us." There was a long pause before Emily nodded, her face crumpling as the tears she had been holding back finally broke free. David stepped forward, wrapping his arms around her gently, feeling her body tremble in his embrace. "I'm sorry, Dad," she whispered, her voice muffled against his shoulder. I don't know how to let go." "You don't have to let go of your mom," David said softly, his voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside him. "She'll always be with you. But you can try to let Sarah in, even if it's just a little. For me. For us." Emily nodded again, her tears soaking into his shirt, and for the first time in a long while, David felt like they might finally be able to move forward, slowly but surely. The next morning, Emily stayed quiet, her words from the previous night still lingering in the air, unspoken but impossible to ignore. She had stayed up late, her thoughts tangled in the raw emotions that had surfaced at the rehearsal dinner. The anger, the hurt, the overwhelming sense of betrayal that she had felt for so many years now seemed more visceral than ever. She hadn't been ready to confront it. She hadn't known just how deeply it had been eating at her until last night, when her emotions had exploded so publicly. She had spent most of the night lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wishing she could just erase everything, pretend nothing had ever changed. But change had happened, and it was impossible to ignore. David had left her alone that night, giving her the space she needed to cool off. She appreciated that. He didn't push. He didn't demand that they fix things immediately. But that didn't make the ache in her chest go away. Emily hadn't been ready to face what had been simmering beneath the surface for so long, and now she was forced to reckon with it. The house was quiet when she awoke, the soft light of early morning filtering through the curtains. She could hear the faint sound of footsteps in the kitchen, the familiar clink of mugs and silverware as someone prepared breakfast. She sat up in bed, pulling the covers around her as she thought about the night before. The pain from her mother's death was still there, always lurking just beneath the surface, and she had been so focused on that, on holding on to her mother's memory, that she hadn't noticed how much her father's life had changed. Or maybe she had noticed, but she had never allowed herself to acknowledge it. Sarah had always been a presence in their lives, but Emily had never let her in, never allowed her to become part of the family. She couldn't. Her mother's death had been sudden, violent, and devastating. One moment Emily had been a typical teenager, rebellious, moody, but secure in the love of both her parents. And the next, everything had shattered. It was like being thrown into a world of uncertainty where nothing made sense anymore. Her father had been broken, but he had carried on. And over the years he had started dating again. At first Emily had been resistant, unwilling to accept that her father could ever love anyone else. Sarah had been one of those people. She had come into their lives gently, cautiously, always trying to be kind, to give Emily the space she needed. But the more Emily resisted, the more Sarah had tried, and Emily had only felt like she was being replaced. In truth, Emily had never really known how to feel about Sarah. She had watched her father and Sarah together, seen the way he looked at her, the way he smiled, and she had hated it. She had hated the way Sarah seemed so easy to love, so effortless in her kindness. But most of all, she had hated the way it made her feel, like she wasn't enough, like her father was slowly forgetting her mother, forgetting their life together. But Sarah had never been trying to replace her mother. Emily had just been too blinded by her grief to see it. The weight of that truth hit her in waves, crashing against the walls she had so carefully built up over the years. It wasn't just about Sarah. It was about everything she had lost. It was about the fact that her mother was never coming back, and no amount of anger or resistance could change that. Emily had spent so many years trying to hold on to a version of her family that no longer existed, and she hadn't even realized how much she was pushing her father away in the process. She stood up slowly, her feet sinking into the soft carpet as she made her way to the kitchen. As she entered, she found her father sitting at the table, sipping his coffee, his brow furrowed in thought. He looked up when he heard her approach, his eyes softening with a mixture of relief and caution. "Morning," he said, his voice warm but cautious, like he wasn't quite sure how to approach her after last night. He had that look on his face, the one that said he was trying to gauge her mood, to figure out if it was safe to have a conversation. "Morning," Emily replied, her voice quieter than usual. She stood in the doorway for a moment, unsure of what to say. She had so much to say, so much to apologize for, but the words felt stuck in her throat. David set his coffee down, his gaze never leaving her face. "I was thinking, we could talk later, if you're up for it." Emily nodded, her eyes dropping to the floor. "I don't know what happened last night," she said quietly. I wasn't ready. I don't think I'll ever be ready to accept it. I don't want things to change." David's expression softened, his eyes filled with compassion. "I know, Em. I know. I never wanted to rush you, but things are changing, whether we want them to or not. I'm not asking you to accept Sarah right now, but I want you to understand something. She's not trying to replace your mom. I'm not trying to replace your mom. I'm just trying to live my life, and I need you to understand that." "I don't know how to understand that," Emily admitted, her voice shaking slightly. She crossed the kitchen and sat down at the table, pulling her knees up to her chest as if trying to protect herself. "I don't know how to let go of the way things used to be." David sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I get that, I really do. But you're not alone in this. You have me, and you have Sarah, and you don't have to carry all of this on your own. We're a family, Em. We may not look like the family you thought we'd be, but that doesn't mean we're any less of one." Emily looked at him, her eyes filled with the storm of emotions she had been bottling up for so long. "I just feel like I'm losing everything, like everything I've known is slipping through my fingers, and I don't know how to stop it." David stood up and moved to her side, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You're not losing anything, sweetheart. Your mom will always be a part of you, and Sarah, she's not trying to take her place. She's just trying to be there for you and for me. I can't make you love her or accept her, but I hope you can see that she's not the enemy." Emily closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. She could feel the weight of her father's words, the truth of them, and it was almost too much to bear. It hurt, but it also made sense. She didn't have to accept Sarah as a mother figure. She didn't have to forget her mom, But maybe, just maybe, she could learn to accept that Sarah was there for her, that Sarah was trying. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. "I don't know how to fix this," Emily whispered, her voice small, fragile. David pulled her into a hug, his arms enveloping her in a comforting embrace. "You don't have to fix anything. You just have to be willing to try." The words hung in the air between them, a tentative promise that neither of them could fully make yet. But for the first time in a long time, Emily felt a flicker of hope, something to hold on to as she navigated the difficult path ahead. She didn't have all the answers, and she didn't know how things would turn out, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't alone in this. They stayed like that for a few moments, Emily clinging to her father as if he were the only thing that could anchor her in the storm. Eventually, she pulled away, wiping the tears from her eyes as she looked up at him. "I'll try," she said quietly. "I'll try, Dad. For you." David smiled, a small relieved smile that softened the lines on his face. "That's all I can ask for, sweetheart. That's all I can ask for." And for the first time in what felt like forever, Emily believed him. She wasn't ready to fix everything, and she wasn't ready to welcome Sarah into her heart, but she was willing to try. That was the first step, and that, she realized, was enough for now. A few weeks had passed since the confrontation at the rehearsal dinner, and while the tension between Emily and Sarah hadn't completely dissipated, things had started to settle into a new rhythm. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever was, but there was an undeniable shift in the air. Emily had agreed to meet Sarah halfway, and although their interactions were still cautious, there was a sense of quiet understanding that hadn't been there before. David had been patient, always giving his daughter space when she needed it, but also encouraging her to be open. He wasn't expecting everything to change overnight, but the small progress was enough to give him hope. The wedding was now just a week away, and though Emily had done her best to push past the awkwardness, the weight of it still hung over her. The idea of being at her father's wedding, standing there as part of his new life, was difficult to reconcile with the image of the family she had once known. It wasn't just the wedding itself, it was everything that had led up to it. The years of silence, the emotional distance she had put between herself and her father, and the rawness of her grief that had kept her from truly accepting Sarah as a part of their lives. Now, the thought of walking down the aisle beside Sarah, watching her father marry another woman, was more than she could process. But things had changed, just a little. Emily had started to see Sarah differently, not as an intruder or a threat, but as someone who genuinely cared about her father. And while Emily wasn't ready to embrace Sarah as a stepmother, she had at least begun to acknowledge the woman's kindness, her patience, and her genuine attempts to be part of the family. It was early morning on the day of the wedding rehearsal, and Emily found herself standing in front of the full-length mirror in her bedroom, adjusting the dress she would wear to the ceremony. It was a soft lavender, simple but elegant, and as she looked at herself in the reflection, she felt a strange mix of emotions. She was nervous for sure, but there was something else, too. Something deep within her that she couldn't quite place. It wasn't exactly dread, but it wasn't excitement either. It was more like anticipation for the unknown. David had asked her earlier that morning if she was ready for the rehearsal dinner. He had done so with a smile, but she could see the worry in his eyes. He had hoped for years, that things would be different, that Emily would be able to accept Sarah into their family, that she would find a way to heal, to move forward, and maybe even to forgive. But Emily wasn't sure she was ready for that. She didn't know how to forgive herself for holding on so tightly to her mother's memory, for refusing to let go of the past and allow room for the present. A knock at the door broke her thoughts, and she quickly turned toward it, smoothing the front of her dress as she called out, "Come in." The door creaked open, and Sarah stepped inside, holding a small box in her hands. She smiled softly, the warmth in her eyes unmistakable, and Emily couldn't help but feel the familiar pang of discomfort that had lingered since their first meeting. But she also recognized that Sarah wasn't trying to make her uncomfortable. It was Emily's own walls that caused that. "You look beautiful," Sarah said, her voice gentle, almost hesitant. She held out the box to Emily. "I thought you might want to wear this tonight. I know it's a bit of a stretch, but I wanted to offer." Emily took the box with a slight frown, opening it slowly to reveal a delicate silver necklace adorned with a small pendant shaped like a mother and child holding hands. It was simple but elegant, and for some reason it struck Emily deeply. She had seen it before in a shop window not far from their house, and had remarked to herself that it looked nice, but she hadn't expected Sarah to notice or remember. She looked up at Sarah, her throat tight. "It's beautiful, but I don't know if I can wear it." Sarah nodded, her face falling just slightly. "I understand. I just wanted to offer it." "You don't have to wear it, Emily, but I thought maybe it could be something we share." For a moment, the world seemed to fall silent around them, the only sound the soft rustle of the dress and the distant hum of the wedding preparations. Emily swallowed hard, her gaze flickering between Sarah and the necklace. In that moment she realized something. It wasn't about Sarah trying to replace her mother. It was about Sarah reaching out, trying to show that she cared, trying to build something with Emily not in spite of her mother's memory, but because of it. And though Emily wasn't ready to accept Sarah as a second mother, she could at least acknowledge that Sarah was trying. Maybe that was enough for now. "I'll wear it," Emily said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't know if she meant it yet, but she was willing to try. Sarah's eyes softened with relief, and she gave a small nod. "Thank you." They stood there for a moment, the silence no longer uncomfortable but instead filled with a quiet understanding. Emily carefully placed the necklace around her neck, her fingers brushing against the cool metal as Sarah helped her adjust it. When she met Sarah's gaze, there was no judgment, no expectation, just an unspoken connection, fragile but real. As they made their way downstairs together, Emily felt the weight of what was coming. The rehearsal dinner would be the first time they would all gather together for a shared event. David, Sarah, Emily, and the rest of the family and friends. It would be a moment of celebration, but also a quiet reminder of the spaces that had yet to be filled, of the grief that still lingered. The dinner was being held at a small, intimate restaurant not far from the wedding venue. It was cozy, with soft lighting and rustic decor that gave it a warm, welcoming feel. As they entered, Emily noticed the familiar faces of family and friends. Some of them she hadn't seen in years. Her eyes immediately searched for her father, and she found him across the room, talking with Sarah. When their gazes met, David smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, and Emily felt a lump form in her throat. She had never truly allowed herself to appreciate the joy that her father had found in Sarah. Maybe it wasn't perfect, but it was real, and for the first time, Emily wasn't so sure she needed everything to be perfect. As the evening unfolded, Emily felt herself slipping into the rhythm of the night. People were laughing, toasting, and enjoying the food, and for a moment, it felt like a normal family dinner, just with a few more people and a few more awkward silences. She found herself sitting next to Sarah, the space between them no longer as vast as it had been before. Sarah didn't try to fill the silence with words. She simply sat beside Emily, offering a small, understanding smile when their eyes met. And when the time came for David to give a speech, Emily's heart skipped a beat. He stood up, glass in hand, and the room quieted down, all attention now on him. Emily's gaze never left him as he began to speak, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight," David began. "This dinner, this moment, means a lot to me. Because it's not just about celebrating my wedding to Sarah. It's about all of us, coming together. It's about family. It's about love, and it's about the people we choose to surround ourselves with. The ones who make us better." He glanced at Emily, his eyes softening with a depth of love that made her chest tighten. "Emily, I know it hasn't been easy, and I don't expect it to be. But I want you to know that I love you. You will always be my daughter. No one can replace your mom, and no one will ever try. But I hope, with time, you'll see that Sarah is part of our family now, and that's something I think your mom would want for us." David paused, his words hanging in the air. Emily felt the tears welling in her eyes, but she didn't look away. She couldn't. This wasn't about her mother, not entirely. It was about the future. About their future together. When he finished, there was a pause before the room erupted into applause. But for Emily, the moment felt suspended in time, her mind racing with emotions she couldn't quite name. She stood up slowly, raising her glass. "To family," she said, her voice shaky but clear, "and to love. And to the people who make us stronger, even when we don't realize it." The room quieted again, and Sarah's eyes glistened with tears as she looked at Emily. There was a sense of peace in that moment, a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, they could move forward, together. And as the night wore on, Emily realized something. She didn't have to have all the answers. She didn't have to embrace everything at once, but she could try. And maybe that was enough. Because sometimes, healing wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about learning to live with it, side by side with the people who mattered most.